Romans, I'm going to start off this week with something a little different, all right? There's going to be a word that appears on the screen. It's actually there. I simply want you to raise your hand if you see the word that appears on the screen. You understand how this game works? You don't say the name of the word. You just raise your hand if you see the word on the screen. Okay, not yet. Okay, you ready? Here we go. Tell me, do you see the word that is on this screen? Raise your hand if you see it. All right? Going to make a change. Raise your hand if you see the word now. Oh, gosh darn it. It's the contrast. You're not supposed to be able to see it yet because I'm going to keep changing the background. Now a few more of you are supposed to be able to see it, and now a few more of you are supposed to be, and now some of you all are going to be seeing it. I ran through this in my classroom, but the brightness is off, and so I couldn't even see it until like this stage, and this time, anyway, I just totally ruined it. All right, so now you all can see this word, and the point was that you are going to be seeing different shades of white and gray in the background, which makes it difficult to see. You understand this, right? You understand the concept. The darker the backdrop, the more the word is going to stand out. This is precisely why for sermon notes I use white on black. This is precisely why whenever I use a highlighting color like red or purple, all of you people in the back, I couldn't even read your highlighted word. Yeah, but you get some eyes. That's my position on all of this. White on black, the sharper the contrast, the more you're able to see it. Yes, we make sense out of this. Everybody understands this. That's why, here's why I'm saying that. Because for the next several verses, really into the next chapter, Paul is going to be writing some really dark stuff. We're going to be studying some pretty dark stuff that he writes in Romans chapter 1 and then on into chapter 2. It is the dark view of the state of humanity. He's going to write about it. And it might be depressing to us unless we understood why he's doing it. It's the same point I was just making, because it's against this dark backdrop of humanity, where we are without the gospel, that the gospel, the glory of Christ's gospel is going to stand out. You get this? The dark backdrop is going to cause the glory of the gospel to stand out. So, if you've got your Bibles, we are in Romans, the first chapter, and we've made it to verse 18. By the way, I've heard some of you grumbling, this is going to take us 3 years. We're still in chapter 1. Listen, we're not going to go through the entire book of Romans right now. We will eventually, but I'm going to break it up, and right now we're on the portion with the gospel. So we're in Romans chapter 1. We've made it to verse 18. Here we go. Y'all there? All right. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against the godlessness and wickedness of men, who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man, and birds, and animals, and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. So Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. I told you last week that sometimes these words will stand out at me. It happens again here with the very second word in this sentence, the wrath of God. Every time I think of wrath, I think of what I faced when I ticked my mom off growing up. The wrath of Lisa was something that nobody wanted to encounter. Every time we hear the word wrath, there is a negative connotation to that. Wrath seems like out of control, belligerence, anger, dishes flying, things being said. So when I read that in the context of the wrath of God, I'm not comfortable with that. We need to understand what that word wrath means. Since God is the standard of goodness, God is goodness. It's how we define and measure what good or bad is. God cannot be unjustly angry. God cannot be bad because God is goodness. When we see the word wrath in reference to the wrath of God, here's what that means. This is the settled, just judgment of God against sin. That's what the wrath of God is. It is settled justice that he brings against sin. And it's being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people. Paul is saying that the gospel is necessary because there's something that all of us face, and it's called the wrath of God. In other words, you want to know one of the reasons that Paul is so motivated in the proclamation of the gospel. Last week I said what? It's his love of Jesus and it's his feeling of obligation to everyone else. Why does he feel that obligation to everyone else? Because he knows, apart from the gospel, what he would have faced. And he knows, apart from the gospel of Christ, what all of us would face. We would face the wrath of God. That's what motivates him. A very important point here. If you've ever wondered, why is the gospel not moving me? Why is the gospel of Christ not changing my life the way it changed Martin Luther's life or any of these other people that I've heard about? Maybe it's this. If you don't take the wrath of God seriously, you don't think about what you would face apart from the gift of the gospel, if you don't take the wrath of God seriously, then the gospel is not going to impress you, and it's not going to empower you. It is when you realize what you would face apart from God's gift in the gospel. It's at that moment that it starts to impress upon you, and you feel empowered and desirous of sharing the gospel of Christ. I want you to notice also, it doesn't say that the wrath of God will be revealed. This isn't talking about the end times when Christ comes back, guns ablazing, and ends all of this. This isn't about you and I facing the judgment seat of Christ. Paul says clearly here that the wrath of God is being revealed. It's being revealed. Right now, currently, the wrath of God is being revealed. So that promotes two questions, at least in my mind, and it should for all of us. Question number one, why is it being revealed? Why is the wrath of God unfolding right now? And secondly, how is it being revealed? In verses 18 through 25, Paul answers those questions, and that's what we're diving into. First of all, why is it being revealed? Well, he says it right there. The godlessness and the wickedness of people. Now listen, sometimes when you read that, you just think Paul is being verbose and he's using synonyms, godlessness, wickedness. That's not what's happening here. Those two words are very distinct. In the original language, they have very distinct meanings. Take a look at this. The godlessness, what are we talking about there? When man invites the wrath of God by being godless, we're talking about him destroying the vertical relationship. The most fundamental relationship you have is with your Creator. And when you do things to interrupt that relationship or harm that relationship, that is godlessness. You remember when Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? What did he say? Okay. Yeah, love the Lord your God with all of your heart. The greatest commandment is the vertical relationship. When we studied the 10 Commandments, what were the first 4 commandments all about? The vertical relationship that we have with God. No other gods before me, no idols, don't misuse my name, honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. All summed up in the greatest commandment, love the Lord your God. Period. When we don't do that, it's godlessness. We are interrupting that vertical relationship. You invite the wrath of God by doing that. Secondly, when we use the term wickedness, when man is wicked, it is the way that we are treating one another, the destruction of our horizontal relationship that we have with fellow men. When Jesus was asked the greatest commandment, he said, love the Lord your God. And then he said what? The second is like it. Yeah, love your neighbor as yourself. There's 2 of you that are familiar with this. Excellent. Right. He says this second part is loving your neighbor as yourself. When we studied the 10 Commandments, all summed up in that second one, Commandments 5 through 10 were what? All about loving your neighbor, fulfilling this second command. Horizontal relationship. Honor mom and dad, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie, and don't covet. All of that is about your horizontal relationship. Why is the wrath of God being revealed? Because mankind is godless and is wicked. He's destroying his vertical relationship and his horizontal relationships. And by the way, Paul immediately addresses exactly what he knows is going to be the objection. And it's the one we hear all the time. Well, I don't know God. I don't follow your Bible. I don't believe like you. So therefore, God can't hold me accountable for all of those things. What about those who don't know God? How can the wrath of God come on people who don't even know him? Paul answers that question, and you know the answer to that question. The wrath of God's being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. In order to suppress something, what does that imply? You had it to begin with. They know the truth, but then choose to suppress it. Now, there are some people out there who suppress it like nobody's business. They have suppressed it for so long and in such strong ways, they don't even remember that they once had it. That is how firm their suppression is, but they had it, is what Paul is saying. We all know the truth, and how do we know the truth? He keeps writing, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and his divine nature have been clearly seen. You know God exists, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Even those that claim that they don't know God, know God. Every single one of us does. People are without excuse. Why? Everyone knows the truth. Everyone knows better. Have you ever wondered why it is? C.S. Lewis wrote this. You ever wondered why it is that you can go back through all of world history and you can never find a civilization where running away in battle was honorable? Never. You cannot find a single civilization where men felt proud for double-crossing the people who had been kindest to them. There is this moral code that runs across generations and across eons of time and across civilizations everywhere on the world. How is that possible? If all of this is just random, chaotic chance, wouldn't there have been some time, some place where people would have felt that way? And you cannot point to a single example of it, where that was the contemporary view of humanity. This is a testimony of creation. They suppress what creation testifies to. Think about our default. Yeah, have you seen the table that Dave Mooring made out there for the coffee? You know what I'm talking about. Have you seen that thing? The way that the wood curves? I don't know how you curve wood. I don't understand that. How do you take a piece of wood and bend it, and then you bend the next piece? I don't get that. My point in saying that is not to honor Dave, okay? Even though great job, Dave, whatever. But if you go out there and you look at that, is there a single person that would look at that in all of its glory and say, you know what? I'm going to believe that that table has just always been here since the beginning of time, unless you prove to me that somebody designed it. No, nobody with a brain would say that. And why? Because you know the intricacies of that design clearly reveal that it had a creator. Man, something as simple as this chair right here that for some reason has glitter on it. Anyway, Evan, was this your chair? You glittering it up this morning? All right. Anyway, looking fancy. So this chair right here, like the way the fabric is tight underneath and the way the screws are all in this, nobody with a brain is going to look at that and say, well, unless you prove to me that that had a creator, I'm just going to assume that it didn't. It's just been that way through all time, right? We all understand this. Nobody believes that way. And yet, when it comes to all life, when it comes to the universe, we automatically switch our default. And we say dumb things like, well, I'm not going to believe in a God and a designer unless you prove to me that there was a designer. Why are you doing that? You don't do that for anything else, but then all of a sudden, whoop, we're suppressing. What are we doing? We're suppressing the truth that we all know. We get this, and we sound as silly, Paul is saying, as when you suggest that that chair didn't have a designer. The complexity of this chair is what tells me it had a designer. Do you know how complex all of this is around us? I did a youth conference once, and I did some research for it, and studied what the scientists say about our universe. Okay, there are 4 fundamental forces in the universe. I can't tell you all of them and what they do and what they mean because that's way above my brain. Anyway, but I do know 2 of them. 2 of them that they wrote about was the strong nuclear forces and the weak nuclear forces behind our universe. And these brilliant, and they're not believing scientists, these brilliant scientists said, what we have found is, and what we've discovered, if the ratio, the balance between the strong and the weak nuclear forces in the universe was off by the tiniest fraction of the tiniest fraction of the tiniest fraction of a percent, no stars could ever form in our universe. And the guys actually wrote in this work that the odds against life existing in the universe are astonishing. It would be impossible except for the fact that we're here. And so it obviously had to happen because we're here. But the odds are astronomical. Okay, we can talk universe or we can make it simpler. Look at yourself. Look at the systems that are running right now in your body. I'll pick one. Right now, you're hearing my voice. Do you know what is happening in here right now as you're hearing my voice? I know you hear, well, I'm making sound, and then you're interpreting it through your brain. No. I'm going to show you a 90-second video that I made for this conference. 90 seconds, and here's what I want you to do as you watch this. As you watch this video, I want you to think with an open mind. Couldn't get the water to come out. Anyway, I want you to think with an open mind. Not a believing mind, not a skeptical mind, an open mind. Does this indicate that there is some sort of fantastic design behind all of this, or could it have just happened by chance. 90 seconds, watch this. Okay, can we just have a moment of honesty? Does that happen by chance? I can firmly believe that Dave's table just came together by chance over billions of years, far more than I can believe that that just happened to occur. That's what Paul's talking about. God's handiwork is everywhere. And you look at something like that and you come away saying, nah, it just happened by chance. Okay, what are you doing? You are suppressing the truth because you don't want to believe that you are owned by someone. You don't want the accountability that comes from the truth that there is a creator. That doesn't excuse you from knowing that there is a creator, just because you choose to suppress that. Now, none of this testimony that creation gives us in nature tells us everything we need to know about God. And I'm not suggesting that. People that make the argument, well, I get in touch with God through nature, and I'm in touch with Him and all that. No, He gave us His Word for a reason. We need to study His Word. We need to know His Word. But this testimony from creation that we see, that is enough to tell every single one of us there is something unimaginably powerful behind all of this. That's what we know to be true. We know it, and then we suppress it. For our own reasons, we suppress it. And by the way, what I'm saying to you right now is the polar opposite of what the culture will preach at you. What does the culture say? You know what the culture says. To hear them tell it, we're the repressed ones. We're the ones who aren't really being ourselves. Here's what they say. They say, you don't see the world as it truly is. You've set up a little box and you live within those rules and you don't really fully express yourself and come to understand the glory of what life really is. But Paul is teaching, no. All of us are repressed, all of us, until we stop holding down the truth that you and I are owned by the Creator. When we stop suppressing that truth and we realize this life isn't our own, it's on loan from the Creator, we are accountable to Him, it's at that moment that we fully understand what this is all about. You see, this is exactly, as long as we suppress that truth in rebellion, we're never going to understand who we are or why we're here or how to live a fulfilled life or why the world is how it is. Do you know how many people outside of Christ struggle their entire lives to try to answer those questions? They place their identity in things like sexuality. They place their identity in things like their jobs. They try to find meaning in all of these things that aren't the Creator because they are suppressing the truth that they don't want, that their lives are owned by somebody who isn't them. This is exactly what Jesus meant when He said, if you know me, you know the truth. And when you know the truth will set you free. Once you realize this life isn't about you, and you don't have to struggle your whole life trying to make yourself into something and be something and create a legacy that everybody will look at you. Once you realize you aren't the star of the show and your life exists to bring glory to me, that's going to set you free. Do you know how freeing that is? That my life, I don't have to worry about that. All I have to do is be faithful. Be faithful to glorifying the name of God wherever He places me. That's all I'm responsible for. By the way, this is exactly, don't read ahead, this is exactly what I was talking about last week, that the gospel itself is so freeing. I can't do this on my own. And once I realize that this is all on Christ, I don't have to live worrying about a God sitting up there putting check marks when I do something good and X's when I do something bad. Jesus destroyed the slate, broke it over His knee. How liberating is that? That's the freedom that is in Christ, and you find it nowhere else. Acknowledging the Creator's right to rule and His right to rule you. That isn't repressive. It's when you suppress that truth. That is what is repressive. And Paul goes on, look what he writes. So they are without excuse, for although they knew God, and they did not honor Him as God or give thanks to Him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. 2 points I want to bring out of this small passage right here. First of all, this line right there. They didn't honor Him as God or give thanks to Him. When I read that, it sounds like God's being petty. I did all this and they didn't even thank me. That's not what's being said here. This is how serious this is. Paul is saying we're a bunch of plagiarists, is what we are. You and I are plagiarists. If you've ever been in academia or you've traveled in academic circles, you know the greatest offense is plagiarism. When you take somebody else's intellectual property and you pass it off as your own, you claim that this is your work when it was somebody else's, you get booted from school, you fail the project, you lose your job. Plagiarism is a serious offense, and Paul is saying that is exactly what those of us who suppress the truth, exactly what we are. I'll prove it to you. Your body sitting right there, right now, in your little chair, you have 37.2 trillion cells in your body. Like Dave's are a little bit more stretched out than mine, but 37.2 trillion cells, we've all got them. That's what's going on. And you remember the cell from school? Yes, the different parts of it? Yes, you got the nucleus and the cell membrane and the Golgi bodies. Those were always my favorite. I loved the Golgi bodies. Anyway, that's the first thing I complimented Jenny when we met. I said, anyway, it doesn't matter. That's not going to... It's not going to end well. 37.2 trillion cells in your body. Every minute, 96 million of those puppies die. 96 million of them, and they're replaced by 96 million new ones. That happens every minute. I've been talking about this for about a minute. You've had 96 million cells die and be replaced with 96 million new. That's what's happening right now. You can look at your hands and freak out because all the little cells that are holding hands and keeping your body together, that's what they're doing right now. Now, here's my question. How many of those cells do you control? I'm serious. If they started freaking out and doing something they weren't supposed to do, how many of you, by giving thought or speaking to them, can get those cells back to doing what they're supposed to do? How many of the 37.2 trillion cells in your body do you control? Zero. So quit acting like this is my life. I'm in control of my body. You aren't in control of jack squat, baby. You don't have any control of it. What you're doing is you're taking something that belongs to God, something that He has done, and you're passing it off as though it is your own. You are plagiarizing what is God's. And that is lacking in humility and gratitude. That's what Paul is saying here. We claim to be independent rather than acknowledging our utmost dependence. If God wasn't holding us together, if God wasn't filling our lungs with air, we're only alive but by the grace of God. That should bring about our utmost dependence upon Him. But here we are as prideful humanity walking around like we're in control of this whole show. We aren't in control of anything. What did I tell you last week? Satan's greatest lure is what? Independence, autonomy, pride. And this is it again. We plagiarize what is God's. We live by the illusion. We strut around like little peacocks. This is my body. I can do with it what I want. It is not your body. It belongs to the Creator. You are suppressing the truth that it belongs to someone else, and you are accountable to Him for what you do with that body that is on loan. And the second point, when we do this, when we suppress the truth, Paul says we become futile in our thinking. Well, you know another way of saying that, futility in thinking is another way of saying we live inconsistent lives. Inconsistently. I'll give you an example of that. Suppose somebody in the congregation this morning stood up and made an impassioned speech that air does not really exist. Air is just a social construct that somebody came up with to get really, really wealthy. And somebody's going to the bank on this whole lie about air really existing. Okay, that person would be an idiot. And why would they be an idiot? Because the whole time they're giving this speech, what would they be doing? Breathing air. They would be using the very thing that they're saying doesn't exist for their existence. In order to make their argument, they're relying on what they're saying doesn't exist. That's futility in thinking. It's inconsistent. Do we do that? Do you realize that there is not a single person who walks around living as if there is no right and wrong? Oh, there are people that do bad things, and we say, well, they don't even know right from wrong. But they know right from wrong. How do I know that? Simply do something wrong to them. Right? If I have a kid that writes a paper on how there is no truth, there is no absolute right and wrong, it's all relative, we all make it up for ourselves, and I take that paper and I write F, I don't like the font you used, and hand it back to them, what are they going to do? They're going to flip their lid. And mom and dad are going to call the school board, and Matt Adams is going to say, stuff it. Anyway, that's exactly how all of this is going to unfold. You wrong somebody, and all of a sudden, those people that don't think there is right and wrong are acknowledging, hey, there's right and wrong. What are we doing there? Make sure you follow this. If there is no God, no moral authority, then there is no such thing as right and wrong. You make it up for yourself, I make it up for myself, and I can't tell you that my right's any better than yours. In other words, for us to believe that there is a moral law, a moral right and wrong, there has to be a moral lawgiver. Otherwise, we're making up the moral law for ourselves. Do you see what's happening here? We live dependent upon a moral law that requires God's existence, but then we deny that God exists. Futility in our thinking. Inconsistent living based on dark hearts and futile minds. And Paul says this isn't going to lead you to abandon worship. Don't misunderstand. We sometimes believe there are people who worship and people who don't worship. No. We all worship. Look at what he writes in verse 25. But they exchanged the truth of God for a lie. And they worship something. They worship the creature rather than the Creator, who's blessed forevermore. That word exchanged, it doesn't mean you don't worship. You simply change the object of your worship. You're exchanging it. You and I, as human beings, are made to worship something. You want another proof of God's existence? Look at humanity. We are made to worship something. And if it's not God, we're going to replace it with something else, usually ourselves. We are purposed creatures. Every single one of us, we have to live for something. Something must and something will capture our allegiance. It will capture our imagination and our fascination. Take the most rabid atheists that there are. They live for what? Some of them live for science. Some of them live for another person, their spouse. They live for their job and their occupation. I don't know what it is, but all of us have to find something to live for. That's what we do. It's where you place your deepest hopes. It's where you turn to in your deepest fears. And whatever that is, you worship it. You serve it. That is your God. And that's exactly what Paul is saying right here. They exchanged the glory of God, the immortal God, for mortal things. Images of mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles and all of that stuff. We do not worship what is immortal. Instead, we replace it with things that are mortal. Things that are fading away, just like us. We worship the created stuff rather than the Creator. And God says that's the behavior of fools. Why would you worship something that itself is subject to the grave like you are? Why are you placing your hopes in something that is going to fade away? You should be placing it not in the created, but in the Creator. And what is the consequence of all of this? Remember the two questions? We know why it's being revealed, the godlessness and the wickedness of men, futile thinking and dark hearts. And how is it being revealed? How does God reveal this? Paul answers, verse 24. Therefore, God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. Look at that line right there. Gave them up in the lusts of their hearts. God's judgment on our godlessness and our wickedness is to give us what we want. This is the freakiest thing in the world. It's where God looks and says, here's what I'm promising you. I own you and I created you and I will fulfill you and satisfy you. And you want this instead? And here it is. Okay, your will be done. Have it. Take what you want so badly. The things that we choose to worship do not free us. They don't satisfy us. They control us. That's exactly what happens. We suppressed what would free us. We suppressed what would fulfill us and what would satisfy us. And we exchange it for something that what? Will never satisfy us, will constantly leave us craving and wanting something more and something different. You can think of this. Lusts, that word is actually epithumia, which is better translated not lusts. It's better translated an over-desire. You desire something, you over-desire it. You want it more than what you actually should, an all-controlling longing that we have. Our heart's problems a lot of the time isn't that we want bad stuff. It's that we want good stuff too much, and it comes to dominate us. It becomes our God. Think of a man, anytime I use the word lust, we all think of sex stuff. And it can be sex stuff, but it doesn't need to be that. Think about, and we all know people like this, who worship their career. That's it. This guy who worships his career, his entire life is wrapped up in that career. He believes that that job is what makes him who he is. It's what makes him somebody. It's how he's respected and how he's known. It drives him. It dominates him. He wants to achieve more and more and more. Do you know what the best thing in the world is that can happen to that man? Tell me. He loses his job. He gets fired, booted from that job. The worst thing that can happen to him is that he gets a promotion. Because when he gets that promotion, it convinces him that he can find blessing and fulfillment in this over-desire. I'm not saying all promotions are bad. Only if you are wrapping up your identity and worshiping the career, that's the worst thing that can happen. I have never been so proud of my brother, Andrew. And he's not here, that's why I'm saying this, and he won't watch the video. That's the only reason I'm bringing this up, because otherwise it would destroy. everything. But anyway, I've never been as proud of him. He was quickly moving up the ranks of the biggest law firm in Indiana, Barnes & Thornburg. He wanted to be a partner. He only needed to put in a few more years of going in at 6 a.m. and leaving at 6 or 7 p.m., and he would achieve that partner status, and that's a big-time paycheck. But Andrew realized those years that I would be doing that are the years that my children are at home. What would I be sacrificing for that? And that dude walked away from a massive paycheck to take a much smaller paying job. I don't know that I would have had the strength to do it. Katie wouldn't have had the strength to do it. I can tell you that right now. I've always been in awe of his ability and willingness to do that. And why? Here's why. Because Andrew realized that the man who does that, who goes after that and wraps his identity there, he loses all that actually matters. You remember Steve Jobs? I know you know Steve Jobs, the guy who was if you own anything in your house that starts with the letter I, it's because of Steve Jobs, okay? He was the Apple CEO and all of that. This guy had been to the mountaintop. You want to talk about somebody that has achieved in their career, you will not find anyone who has achieved in their career more than Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs had cancer, and towards the end of his life, somebody was interviewing him, and he said, you know the greatest thing I ever did? 10,000 times better than anything I've ever done was having children. Steve Jobs also, if you don't know the end of his story, had his biography written. He invited a biographer in, which surprised a lot of people because there's never been a person, well, very few, as private an individual as Steve Jobs. He kept to himself. And so New York Times Magazine asked him the question, Steve, why are you relenting to the questions, the probing questions of a biographer when you've always been this private? Do you know what he said? This is an exact quote of Steve Jobs. He said, I wanted my children to know me. I wasn't always there for them, so I wanted them to know why and what it is that I did. Now think that through. A guy who himself acknowledged that having a family and children was 10,000 times more important than anything he did at work. He spent so much time doing that thing that was 10,000 times less important that he had to hire a biographer so that his kids, who were 10,000 times more important than his work, would even know who he was. That's what I'm talking about. That's what we're discussing right here. God's wrath is to give us what we want too much. He gives us over to the pursuit of the things that we put in place of Him. So what's the takeaway? Here it is. 4 things this week, the next 6 days. Consciously do this. Make the effort. Consciously elevate the Creator over everything and tame your over desires. Listen, I know that I'm not the only one who is convicted by that idea, that there are over desires in my life, things that I am pursuing too much, and it's wrecking my vertical and my horizontal relationship, because that's number 2. Foster those vertical and those horizontal relationships. Do what you are called to do. Don't bring on the wrath of God by your disobedience to that command. Tame those over desires and end the plagiarism. Stop pretending that you own this. You don't. You are owned by a Creator. You are accountable to a Creator. Start exalting Him and lessening yourself. And lastly, I'm begging you, don't lose heart. And here's why I'm saying that. Because I told you that this was going to be a dark backdrop. And I'll tell you who it's especially dark for. It's especially dark for people who may be dealing with this wrath right now. They are being given what they have overly pursued. And you are sitting in a position that you don't know if there's a way out, and if there is, what it is. I want to give you, even though this is a dark backdrop, I want to give you, before I close, one glimmer of hope. And Paul put it right there in verse 25. Look at the very end of verse 25. They exchanged the truth of God. They did all of this. The Creator who is forever praised. Those words right there tell you what the answer is. The way out of all of this is to stop suppressing truth and to start praising God. To elevate God back to His proper position in your life. To understand what this life is all about. That there is a God and you aren't Him, and you owe Him everything. And you know where you get the motivation for that? Tell me if you can see this on the screen. That's where you get the motivation. Submit to the gospel of Christ and it will change you forever. If you have that decision to make, would you come as we stand and as we sing?